In Europe, when a gag order was lifted on a scientist to explain that the generic process of genetic engineering was unsafe and caused massive damage to rats, he was actually a pro-GMO scientist working on a government grant when he discovered this problem. Hundreds of articles were written in the European press within a month, and within 10 weeks, so many people were concerned that the food companies had their tipping point. They said, okay, no more GMOs in Europe. But the same report was not handled by the U.S. press, and so the in-the-dark Americans have been eating GMOs for 18 years longer because we didn't have the education about the dangers of GMOs. That's changing.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
I'm your host, Hoda Labrada Gore. This is episode 50, and my guest is Jeffrey Smith of the Institute for Responsible Technology. The Institute for Responsible Technology was founded in 2003 by Jeffrey, who is a best-selling author and GMO expert. Jeffrey's passion is to make the world aware of the myths and truths of GMOs. You will hear it come across in today's interview. You will get the benefit of his years of extensive research and communication on the topic. You'll learn about the dangers that GMOs pose in our food supply and even in the animals' food supply. And he'll also give you concrete tips about how to protect yourself and your family from the health risk that's posed by GMOs. Before we get into it, we want to acknowledge our sponsors. Wise Traditions is supported in part by Green Pasture Products. Green Pasture Products offering fermented cod liver oil, concentrated butter oil, and coconut oil in a variety of products and blends. Visit greenpastureproducts.com. And listeners like you, we are grateful for your encouragement and any financial support you can send our way that keeps us on the air. Thank you so much. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Jeffrey.
Thank you.
Now, I know you're a proponent of non-GMO and organic food. What changes do people notice if they switch to non-GMO and organic foods?
Well, actually, I think I've heard more testimonials than perhaps anyone in the world on just this topic. Actually, people started coming to me years ago saying they could notice a change when they ate GMOs versus non-GMOs, and I actually didn't believe them in the beginning. I thought that, well, there's probably some small change in the overall health statistics, but I kind of didn't believe that individuals could notice a difference until I started educating the medical community, and I started hearing from doctors who were prescribing non-GMO diets who are absolutely convinced not only that a non-GMO and organic diet can make changes, but they tell me how many days it took for anxiety and depression to go away, for allergies and asthma, for digestive disorders. So I actually went to a medical clinic to confirm for myself with a video camera, and sure enough, people were having dramatic changes. And so starting in 2012, when I released my film Genetic Roulette, I started asking from the stage what people's responses were when they switched to non-GMO organic, and I've been deluged with so many stories. In fact, in 2012, I was at MIT. I was giving a talk with Stephanie Seneff, and someone from the audience answered the question, said, my 6.5-year-old was violent and out of control, and they wanted to kick him out of school. I saw your film, Genetic Roulette, changed his diet, and all the problems went away. I said, how long did it take? She said, 1 week. And then she paused and said, within a month, I had a new son. Then I was speaking at a conference in California, and a woman who was just volunteering at my booth said that she had seen the movie Genetic Roulette and realized that food was affecting her grandson. So she convinced her son to watch the film. He realized that it's probably the food, and they switched his food. Prior to changing the food, he would constantly be acting out in class, and family would get calls nearly every day, and he had trouble breathing. All of those problems went away, except, I was told, when he ate the previous night at the other grandparents' house. So for some kids, the reaction is very quick. So I took this information and used it as a basis for a new film I'm creating called Secret Ingredients, which will be released in 2017. And it's all about families that heal from serious diseases. We have former autistic kids. We have formerly infertile couples, people who used to have cancer, used to have skin problems, used to have depression, etc. And then we have the doctor saying these changes in these individuals are typical of a percentage of our patients when we switch them to organic. And then we have the scientists explaining why.
Well, Jeffrey, this sounds fantastic. My question is, these are anecdotal stories. What evidence is there to back up the fact that non-GMO and organic foods can improve someone's health?
Yes, and that's what I've been drilling down to for 20 years. And right now, I'd say the evidence is overwhelming. First of all, for those that don't know, a GMO is where you have genes inserted or rearranged artificially in an organism. So you can force bacterial or viral genes into soybeans, for example, and the soybeans don't die when sprayed with Roundup. That's the main reason they genetically engineer it, to create herbicide-tolerant crops so the chemical companies that create the seeds can sell more chemicals. And we end up eating, of course, these chemicals. You can't wash off Roundup because it goes into the plant, and we end up being exposed to this very nasty toxin. There's also corn and cotton plants that are engineered to produce their own insecticide, and that insecticide kills insects by poking holes in their stomach. And it is found to also poke holes in human cells in test tube situations. So we have a situation now where soy, corn, cotton, canola, sugar beets, alfalfa, papaya, zucchini, yellow squash, and now apples and potatoes, small portion has been introduced as genetically modified with this transgene, insertion of foreign genes into the DNA or rearranging of existing genes. So the issue is, are these unsafe?
Right.
Now, when it was originally introduced, the FDA scientists said, oh, yeah, they're definitely not the same as traditional breeding. They need to be tested. They have dangers associated with them, allergens, toxins, new diseases, and nutritional problems, and they were ignored. The White House had been instructing the FDA to promote GMOs, and so they put Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, in charge of policy. Monsanto's the big GMO company, and then he said no testing was necessary because we don't see any real difference between GMOs and non-GMOs. And then he became Monsanto's vice president and then back at the FDA as the U.S. food czar. But documents made public from a lawsuit showed that it was all a lie, that the scientists working at the FDA had complete disagreement with the actual policy and that they totally did not agree that there was no significant difference. So is it true that their concerns were valid? Well, if we look at the animal feeding studies, as the American Academy of Environmental Medicine did 7 years ago, they found that the animals that were fed GMOs in these carefully controlled lab experiments suffered from gastrointestinal problems, immune system problems, reproductive problems, organ damage, and other issues, and said based on scientific criteria, there was a causal relationship and all doctors should prescribe non-GMO diets to their patients. Since then, there's been even more evidence showing early death, tumors, possible cancer, hormonal disruptions, etc., in animal feeding studies. Now, if you look at what I found in about 150 lectures asking audiences what they experienced when they switched to non-GMO diets, and you compare that list to the list of the things that were afflicting the lab animals, they're pretty much consistent, the same categories. And the anecdotal evidence goes further and accumulates into data because we surveyed 3,600 people who said that they actually experienced improvements. And the order of those improvements, starting with gastrointestinal, then increased energy, then reduced weight, and then brain fog, and then we have all sorts of things from anxiety and depression to pain to things like fibromyalgia and headaches and skin conditions. That order was basically the same order that I was hearing from people in the audiences. Now, it's interesting that when someone goes non-GMO, and I'm sure some of the people in the audiences have already had this experience, that they're not labeled as GMO, so you have to create a strategy. And so some people will go at the same time organic and gluten-free and whatnot. And it's hard to know what exactly the cause is. Now, with the animal feeding studies, it's just that one substitution. But so too on the farm with livestock who are switched from GMO soy and corn to non-GMO soy and corn. And we hear from the farmers and the veterinarians that the livestock also get better from these same diseases and disorders. Furthermore, the same categories of diseases and disorders are on the rise in the U.S. population in parallel with the increased use of GMOs and the Roundup sprayed on them. Finally, to top things off, if you look at the laboratory studies and the modes of action of Roundup, of the Bt toxin, and of the generic damage that occurs as a result of the process of genetic engineering, you could predict that these same diseases and disorders would rise in the U.S. population and afflict individuals who are sensitive. In fact, I asked Dr. Seralini, who's done more research on GMOs and Roundup than any other independent scientist in the world, and he said, yes, based on the laboratories, you would predict that the first result would be gastrointestinal, which is the highest result we've seen, and then we would see hormonal problems, which could lead to organ damage and heart issues. So it's a pretty consistent theme where the same categories appear to be very related to consumption of GMOs and of Roundup, which is not just sprayed on GMOs, but also some non-GMO food as well.
Well, this is alarming. When you mentioned all of the issues the animals were having, I didn't need to wait for you to say humans were having it too, because all I have to do is look around. And I can see that, my friend is struggling with a gastrointestinal issue, or there's a rise of, attention issues and asthma and all these other things. So why isn't the public more alarmed, Jeffrey?
Well, actually, we're getting there. 58% of Americans say they're seeking non-GMO foods. Not everyone actually does what they say, but there's enough agitation and concern, thousands of doctors prescribing non-GMO diets, that the market is moving. The tipping point is underway, something I've been working towards for 20 years. The latest this week was Buitoni, Nestle's refrigerated pasta and sauce company, declared they're going non-GMO. Nestle's already indicated that most of its ice cream would be non-GMO. And one after the other, these food companies are saying, because of consumer concern, we're eliminating GMOs from our supply chain. And this means that they've been trying to do it for maybe years already, and they're ready to now announce it because either have it under control or they have a deadline that they can meet. So that's what's happening in the background. Enough people, and you don't need 51% like a vote. You just need enough to influence market share and the concern of these executives. Enough people are concerned. So we don't need to have a mass education campaign in order to have a mass movement of the food supply. In Europe, when a gag order was lifted on a scientist to explain that the generic process of genetic engineering was unsafe and caused massive damage to rats, he was actually a pro-GMO scientist working on a government grant when he discovered this problem. Hundreds of articles were written in the European press within a month, and within 10 weeks, so many people were concerned that the food companies had their tipping point. They said, okay, no more GMOs in Europe. But the same report was not handled by the U.S. press, and so the in-the-dark Americans have been eating GMOs for 18 years longer because we didn't have the education about the dangers of GMOs. That's changing. Now, the mainstream media is often biased towards running the PR lies that Monsanto and friends put out, that it's supposed to feed the world, which it can't, that it's supposed to reduce the use of pesticides, which it doesn't, that it's considered safe and tested carefully, which it's not. So a lot of people hear that in an echo chamber of well-funded, well-placed articles and reports. But those paying attention on other sources of media and drilling down a little further realize that the industry is using tobacco science, checkbook science, to force conclusions of safety, even though their data show other things. And then when independent scientists find problems, they're serious, and yet the scientists are then attacked in a knee-jerk fashion by an echo chamber of friends in high places of Monsanto, and we get a suppressed coverage of some of these really serious issues. But fortunately, we've been able to get the word out above the noise to so many people that the world is changing.
Wow, that's fantastic. Well, it gives me hope. Now, I was wondering if you could go ahead and elaborate on those points you made that the GMO proponents are putting forth, like GMOs are supposed to help feed the world. How is it that they can't?
Well, if you haven't heard that they're supposed to feed the world, you haven't been paying attention, because they spent $250 million over 5 years, more than a decade ago, to try and convince Americans that this was the key to feed the world and that we had a moral responsibility to accept their faulty, dangerous science. The most comprehensive evaluation in terms of how to feed the world was done, sponsored by the UN, and it was a paper or a report sponsored and written by more than 400 scientists, signed on by 59 countries, and it declared that GMOs have nothing to offer to feed the hungry world, eradicate poverty, or create sustainable agriculture. They put forward agroecology. And, there's this myth that it is all about increased yields that are necessary. It turns out GMOs don't increase average yields, but even if they did, we have more food per person than any time in human history, and yet 1 billion people go to bed hungry or malnourished every night. It's about access and distribution, not about yield. However, if it were about yield, then the GMOs fail, and agroecology, which can double yields in developing countries, is clearly the winner. So that's one of the things that we should be clear on, that if you hear someone repeating that it's to feed the world, they're either the liars or the lied to. Mostly it's the lied to. Most people don't realize the truth. They just parrot or repeat what they've heard. But in some cases, people absolutely know the truth, but for marketing purposes, they will suppress what they know and lie. And we've seen things, for example, where people know the truth and don't come forward with it. Someone I met who used to be a Monsanto scientist said that 3 of his colleagues who were studying the milk from cows treated with Monsanto's bovine growth hormone found so much cancer-promoting hormone in the milk, the 3 Monsanto scientists refused to drink milk thereafter unless it was organic, and one bought his own cow. They also said that when they found that corn was negatively affecting the health of rats in a study, they rewrote the study to hide the effects. So there's certain people that are clearly lying to us because they know the truth and they don't want to say what the truth is, either because they'll lose their job or because they're promoting a product. And then most people are repeating those lies.
We want to pause now and thank our sponsors, Green Pasture Products. Green Pasture Products produces fermented cod liver oil and concentrated butter oil in a variety of flavors in liquid gel and capsule form. They also offer organic virgin coconut oil, virgin coconut ghee, and a complete oil blend that includes all of the nourishing oils. Lastly, they produce skincare balms and various byproducts that enrich the soil and feed of farm animals. Go to greenpastureproducts.com. And listeners like you, C.S. Burney had this to say on iTunes: "I will never feel guilty about eating bacon again. Every time I listen to one of Hilda's interviews, I learn something, usually something that all of us really ought to know about our health and our eating. Cheers to the Weston A. Price Foundation." Thanks so much, C.S. Burney. Hey, and please follow this listener's example and review our show on iTunes. It helps more people find out about wise traditions. And what about the pesticide argument?
Well, there's 2 types of pesticide influence. One is the herbicide-tolerant crops, and those are absolutely clear that the amount of herbicide used is way higher as a result. So originally, when Roundup-ready crops came out, the herbicide use, Roundup and others, went down for 2 or 3 years, then it was neutral for 2 years, and then it went up, and now it's skyrocketing. One of the main reasons is that herbicide overuse of Roundup has created herbicide-tolerant or Roundup-resistant weeds in about half of U.S. acreage in where soy and corn and cotton are planted. So they're having to put more and more and more Roundup, and now they're mixing cocktails of other toxins. So over the first 16 years of GMOs, and they've been around for 20, there's been an increase of 527 million pounds of herbicide, and there's also a much bigger increase in the last 4 years beyond that. The other category are the corn and cotton plants that produce their own toxic insecticide. Now, oftentimes there is a reduction in the amount of spraying of insecticides on those acreage, and sometimes it backfires because the toxin inside the corn or cotton will kill one pest and allow another pest to infiltrate, and then the farmer has to spray 15 or 20 times in some cases, as we found in places in China. In other cases, they're just ignoring the overall pesticide load in the acreage, because when they say there's a reduction of insecticide, it's putting blinders on. What they're saying is we're not spraying as much. But however, there's 2 ways that pesticides get on the property, get on the acreage that don't require spraying. One is that the plants are actually registered as pesticides. They produce more pesticides in the crop themselves than are displaced by spraying. So they can actually produce 12 times the amount of Bt toxin in the acre compared to the amount of spray that is not used. Furthermore, because the Bt toxin in the soil to kill the corn rootworm, for example, takes a few weeks or few days to work, they need another way of killing the rootworm, and so they soak the seeds with a time-released systemic pesticide, and that often also relates to the killing of the bees, the colony collapse disorder, because they're neonicotinoids. And if you add the neonicotinoids together and the Bt toxin, you end up with far more insecticide that is on the crop, in the environment, and also consumed by those of us who are eating, for example, corn products.
And how does that affect us? So you're mentioning all these insecticides and herbicides. How does that compounded amount on our food affect our personal health?
Well, let's talk about Roundup for a second. Roundup is patented as a chelator. It was originally used to clean the mineral deposits off of boilers and pipes in factories. So it grabs the minerals and makes them unavailable. And that's how it kills plants, by making the minerals unavailable to the plant. So the plant defenses become weak, and then it promotes the pathogens in the soil which kill the plant. So the first thing it does is it robs us of important minerals. Well, then it also can block another pathway that allows the liver to detox. That means all the other poisons in your system that are normally detoxed to the liver can be amplified because the liver detox is not functioning as well. So that's just the mineral deficiency piece.
Right.
Roundup, or glyphosate is the active ingredient, is also patented as an antibiotic. And everyone on the call, I hope, knows about the importance of our gut bacteria, our microbiome, for detoxification, digestion, and immunity. And the balance of that is absolutely critical for a healthy body and longevity. And what we have is a situation where when you eat something that's laced with Roundup, it'll kill the positive gut bacteria, the lactobacillus, the bifidus, and it will not kill easily the dangerous stuff like botulism, salmonella, E. coli, which can overgrow. That can cause digestive disorders, leaky gut, which is linked to cancer, heart disease, autism, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, autoimmune disease, inflammation, and allergies, among others. Then also Roundup is a mitochondrial toxin, and that means that the energy centers of the cells can be dismantled or destroyed or damaged. And that's linked to another long list of diseases, including that what we already mentioned, reduced energy and brain fog. In addition, it's an endocrine disruptor, which can theoretically push off the balance of our sex hormones and other hormones, which can affect organ health. And it's also a class 2A carcinogen, so it might be promoting cancer. We believe that it is. It also can suppress digestive enzymes, according to research, damage the gaps between the cells and the intestines. And I'm just getting started. So you have a situation, and it also can promote birth defects.
Wow.
So I'm talking about an herbicide which is sprayed on more than 80% of GMOs, but it's also sprayed on the grains in the United States: wheat, barley, rye, rice. It's also sprayed on the pulses like lentils. It's also sprayed on fruits and vegetables like potatoes, sweet potatoes, kiwi, wine grapes. So there's over 160 varieties of crops that are approved for high concentrations of glyphosate. No one has yet evaluated where it is in high concentrations in the food supply. So that's why it's a critical thing to switch to organic, not just non-GMO, because some non-GMO breads, for example, are from wheat that's been sprayed with herbicide. Even though wheat's not genetically modified, it's been sprayed. So this is an example of one danger that should raise the alert and guide our choices for what we buy in the supermarket, farmer's market, or elsewhere. And that's just the Roundup. And then you have the generic process of genetic engineering, which can cause massive collateral damage up and down the genome, increasing the allergens, toxins, carcinogens, anti-nutrients. These are the things that were of concern to the FDA scientists. And we do know that they do, in fact, have these problems. Monsanto's corn has a new allergen. Monsanto's soy has an increased level of an existing allergen. And this is the background noise as a result of the technology that isn't even evaluated by the companies themselves, or if it is, in the case of their soy, it's not reported. It had to be found secretly hidden away in an archives of a journal for us to realize that Monsanto was aware that there was a 7-fold increase in an allergen in their soy that they had hidden from public view.
Wow. Just hearing you go through all these makes me think it's a miracle that we're all standing upright. But we are going through a health crisis, and this may be more linked to GMOs and these associated pesticides and herbicides that are all a part of not only our own diet, but the diet of the animals that we ingest.
Yeah, I've heard from many farmers that when the animals switch to a non-GMO diet, there's a change that's absolutely unmistakable. And I'll share 2 stories. A friend of mine, Ib Pedersen, switched from GM soy to non-GM soy for his pigs and did not tell his farmhand. But 2 days later, the farmhand came and said, "You've changed the feed." And he said, "Uh-oh, why do you say that?" And he said, "No more diarrhea." For 2 years on GM soy, they had intractable diarrhea and killing up to 30% of the offspring. And in 2 days, there was no more diarrhea on the non-GMO soy. He also had increased litter size, increased conception rate, lower death rate, and a reduced amount of birth defects, among others, and also deaths from gastrointestinal disorders. So he was making $112 more per pig, even though he was spending more on the non-GM soy. Now, at the same time in Western Iowa, someone else that I've spoken with was convinced to try to go to non-GMO corn. And they had 3,000 pigs in a nursery, and 2 or 3 days into the non-GMO corn, and they were still feeding the GMO soy at this point, they noticed that there was a change in the pigs, that their energy level was different, their behavior was different. And two brothers were walking and said, "What's going on?" And one joked and says, "Maybe it's that non-GMO corn." And they laughed, thinking that was a ridiculous notion. But 11 days after the switch, they called the person that had recommended the change, and this is also in my movie Genetic Roulette. And the guy was so excited, he was stuttering and almost incoherent because he had realized he had solved a problem in a puzzle that had been bothering him for 14 years. 14 years ago, they switched to GMO grain, and there was all sorts of problems that happened right after that with his pigs. He went from being derided by his brothers as having the easiest job on the farm because he was handling the nursery to the toughest job because he kept inoculating these sick animals, and they blamed it not on the GMOs, but on new genetics, new types of pigs brought into the area and from Canada, etc. And only after they switched to non-GMO corn and saw the health return to the animals and the energy and the vitality return to their pigs that they'd been working with every day for decades, then they realized it wasn't the new genetics, it was the food. And so they also marked very carefully the changes. And whereas in Denmark, it was showing about a 2/3 reduction in antibiotics, in Western Iowa, they were showing a 3/4 drop in overall use of medicines. So they also made more money on a non-GMO feed diet.
Wow. This is fantastic. And the Europeans have stemmed the supply of GMOs in their diet. What can we do in the U.S. to do that?
Well, I'm going to give 3 choices for what we can do. The first and foremost is to protect yourself and your family. And the number one recommendation is to buy organic. Non-GMO is not good enough to protect you from Roundup. Now, if you see the non-GMO project seal, that's the best way of declaring something non-GMO. And if you can't buy organic, at least get non-GMO. Our non-GMO shoppingguide.com tells people how to avoid GMOs and lists the 35,000 products that are verified as non-GMO. There's one benefit of the non-GMO project that's unique in that they require testing to see if contamination has occurred, where organic does not require testing. It's just outlawed to use GMOs. So if you see organic and non-GMO project verified together in the same label, that's actually the gold standard. So the first thing is to protect yourself. The second is to get involved. And on our website, responsibletechnology.org, I encourage everyone to immediately sign up for our newsletter and to also like our Facebook page at the Institute for Responsible Technology so that you can be a click and send revolutionary. If you want to join with others in your area, we have a Tipping Point network. We have a speaker training program online, plenty of ways and assets that you can deploy in your area on your own or with others. And third, for those that can afford it, we encourage donations of any amount, ideally recurring, because that's our fuel. We have been extremely successful in getting the word out about the health dangers. In fact, when I started our institute, other NGOs were using a maximum of 3 sentences about the health dangers, which I can repeat, but I don't need to bother. And we've helped change the world debate and discussion on GMOs by translating the science into English in ways that everyone could understand. And that turns out to be behavior change messaging, which turns out to be the key to winning this. And that's why the tipping point is underway in the United States. We want to export that model to other countries. We want to export the model to animal feed, which is not as impacted as direct food. We want to get the new film out called Secret Ingredients at secretingredientsmovie.com. You can watch the trailer. So for those that would like to help support our efforts, a donation would be very, very warmly accepted and appreciated and spent wisely.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for being on the show today. You've really informed us a lot about the dangers of GMOs and what we can do to stem the tide and turn things around for our health and for future generations. We are grateful to you. Thanks for coming out today.
Thank you so much, and safe eating.
My guest today was Jeffrey Smith of the Institute for Responsible Technology. Visit his website, responsibletechnology.org, for info on the important work his group is doing, or just go to westinaprice.org, click on the word podcast, and go to the show notes for episode 50 for related links and information mentioned on this episode. And a huge thank you to Podcast Village for your help with producing this podcast. I couldn't do it without you, my friend.
Thanks for listening today. Our website, westinaprice.org, offers free resources to address your questions and support your journey to health. You'll find videos, articles, and brochures covering a broad variety of health topics. Wise Traditions is brought to you by the Weston A. Price Foundation for Wise Traditions in Food, Farming, and the Healing Arts. The content of this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended as a substitute for medical advice.